Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray. This, of course, is your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related material where I attempt to answer a question from a reader, listener, or viewer. And, of course, you can ask us a question however you'd like. You can send us a postcard, you can send us an email, you can comment on a previous podcast or video, and they'll get to me. You can back us on Patreon, one of three different levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Right, now, I've got a few questions to get through. Here's the first one. This is from TheSgruby. That's how I'm going to say it. Hello. How important were Evocati in terms of politics and military affairs at Rome? What was the first and last mention of them? Okay, gosh. Okay, the second part, bit trickier, the first and last mention. And the funny thing about the Evocatus, there's actually an article in the current magazine about the Evocatus, but not the Evocatus as we understand it to be a veteran, which is the main meaning of the Evocati, veterans. But actually where it comes from before that, the evoking, which is, of course, where we get the word evoke from, enticing them to come back, which, of course, is entirely to do with what the veterans of Roman armies who are then recalled to service. So they've done their 25 years of service as a legionary, and they're brought back into the armies, sort of re-enrolled, re-enlisted, sometimes voluntarily for the army after their service. So somewhat convolutedly, that says what they are. So technically, an evocatus, plural evocati, a soldier in the Roman army who'd served out their time and had been discharged and then voluntarily enlisted again at the invitation of the consul or another commander. Now, interestingly, sometimes they are enlisted. So we get lots of examples in the civil wars, Caesar and Pompey and others, for instance. And we get some other indications. So as far as I can tell, the earliest reference to them is actually in Dionysius of Halicarnassus, referring to the 5th century BC. Hard to know when you've got a figure like that, if you're actually dealing with an accurate historical source, or whether you're dealing with a anachronistic reference. And Dionysius of Halicarnassus is talking about Rome's greatest soldier, Lucius Siccius Donatus, who in 454 BC or 458 BC, around then, has enrolled in the army. He's already served since about 510, so he's well past, serviceable age. And what we get told by Dionysius is, in this particular account, that he, in basically the Aequi are fighting against the Romans at this point in time, and according to Dionysius, Siccius steps up and, showing that by his own valor and that of the 800 veterans with him, whom the consuls had sent to be slain, the camp of the Aequians was taken and the army arrayed against the consuls, when the army arrayed against the consuls had been put to flight. So here it seems that Donatus, and who commands this cohort, now, problem is it's a cohort well before cohort, so that's one of these ideas that it might be anachronistic. But these 800 veterans seem to have enrolled on their own recognizance. They've decided to enroll because there's a crisis for Rome, and the consuls seem to resent them, and so they send them off on the suicide mission, which they then succeed in, which is part of the point which leads to the establishment of Donatus as a tribune. Anyway, that seems to be the earliest mention, but it's not completely reliable as a piece of evidence. But then the idea that a Roman veteran would re-enlist when Rome was under threat, even if not called upon by a commander or the consul, does make a lot of sense. So, yeah, it's tricky. I think that's entirely plausible that that's how the Evocati began, even if it's not quite as cut and dry and bang, here's when they are, made into a reform. I think it suits the idea of Roman citizens defending the city-state if the city-state is threatened to come out of retirement voluntarily. You then get, of course, the better-known examples in the wars. So, for instance, in Flamininus in 198 BC, takes 3,000 Evocati with him to Macedonia, and Polybius also talks about them in that early 2nd century BC. Now, the funny thing about that number is it's too small. It's not a legion. It's how are they organized? How do you use 3,000 men outside the normal realm of a legionary organization? Later, we get pseudo-hygienists talking about the Roman camp, giving a place to the Evocati in camps as well. You find them in the reforms of Marius, where, the army is a profession, and when they come back, we are then told by Caesar that they're given double pay. So again, when you've got the erosion of the need for property requirements to be a legionary, and you're earning pay as a legionary, if you survive and have the option to come back into the Roman army at double pay, why wouldn't you? So you get that from Marius onwards, and we then get the idea that they are not required to do basic fatigue duty, so they're not involved in making roads or making the camp. That's Tacitus telling us that. And that they hold a higher rank, but which makes Evocatus a rank, and you do have some inscriptions of Evocati. I think when we look at the entire corpus of inscriptions, we've got a total of 280 individuals who we know to be Evocati, and most of them, that's the highest rank they ever achieve. Sorry, I just did air quotes for anyone listening to the podcast. So Evocatus does seem to be a rank, but of course, when you talk about the ranks of the Roman army, no one puts Evocatus in there as a rank. Legionary, Optio, Centurion, da-da-da. But Evocatus seems to have been a higher ranking soldier, even if they're technically only a milites than just a standard non-veteran legionary. So that's another sort of complication. You've then got lots and lots of mentions, as I said, in Caesar. Cicero mentions them a lot and talks of a praefectus evocatorum, so a prefect of the Evocati, which could be that unit of 3,000 and things like that. They might be commanded by a prefect. And so you then get into the 1st century AD, the idea of the Evocati being used almost as a bodyguard. Galba has a select body of equestrian men who are called Evocati to guard his bedchamber. That's in Suetonius. And some say that then continued, and they are called the Evocati Augusti, but we're not sure. Now, as to the last mention, wow, they're not mentioned as far as I can tell by Ammianus Marcellinus. They're not mentioned as far as I can tell by 3rd or 4th century historians. So it seems as if you've got 2nd century. Now, the interesting thing under with the exception of those Galba Evocati, the Evocati in the Principate aren't just normal legionaries recalled to service. It would seem that most of the Evocati in the Principate have either been members of the Praetorian Guard or the urban cohorts. That seems to be a sort of an exception and a change, but of course, as so often, the word evocatus is just used, so there's no real change in the word, but there may have been a nuance in the development of its meaning, which we're kind of never given. We sort of need to look at it and go, hang on, these are all Praetorian guardsmen in the 1st and 2nd centuries. What we've then got is a mention of the Evocati in the late 2nd century, in AD 197, 198, an inscription set up to the 12th and 14th urban cohort men who had re-enlisted. That's set up in 218. So that seems to be the last mention. They are mentioned by Dio Cassius, so it's possible that he's using that term. So what does Dio Cassius say? Dio Cassius says in book 45 that, and he's talking about Antony, so he's setting it in the 1st century BC, but he's talking about, from these men was constituted the core of the Evocati, which one might translate as the recalled, because after having ended their military service, they were recalled to do it again. Now, in Dio, it implies, even though there's a gloss there where he explains what the term means, you can take that two ways. One is that he glosses it because the term has fallen out of use and therefore needs a gloss to explain what it is. The other is to remind readers so that he uses the Evocati and he's familiar with that term, so it's possible that it still exists. And we do have these inscriptions and a couple of other examples that are from the early 3rd century. So it would seem that the early 3rd century is when these veterans are around. Whether you've still got veterans who are being enlisted in the Roman army after that, but not called Evocati, because you do, of course, in the later Roman army have double pay men for various different reasons. And as we hear from Caesar, they're double pay men when they're Evocati back in the Republic. So that seems to be what they are. Now, they're not a territorial force. You get some translations calling Evocati reservists, where you go off active duty and you become a reserve member of the military as required for a certain length of time. That's an anachronistic, allegorical parallel from 19th and 20th century warfare. It would seem that as soon as you finish your service, you're not required or expected or obligated to serve again, and that you're recalled, evoked back into service by money, certainly in the Republican era, and even later when they're double pay. So that idea is that they're reservists is wrong and wrong-headed. It's a unit who come back. And again, that earliest one is out of a sort of sense of national pride, for lack of a better term, but later it's an economic decision. So there's no expectation that as a retired veteran you would come back into service if needed. You need to be coaxed, asked, evoked back into military service. And we don't know how long they serve for, whether it's for a campaign, whether it's as long as they like. Certainly doesn't seem to be a re-enlisting, because that's a different thing. And there are examples of men who do re-enlist for an entire length of service. Anyway, I hope, TheSgruby, that answers your question. And join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.